The emergency beacon cut through the static like a knife through flesh, its alien harmonics making the communication array aboard the UES Valkyrie shudder with sympathetic vibrations. Communications officer Sarah Chun frowned at her displays, watching the translation algorithm struggle to make sense of the desperate transmission bleeding through subspace. "Captain, you need to hear this," she called across the bridge, her voice tight with concern. Captain Marcus Rodriguez stepped down from his command platform, his weathered face creased with the kind of lines that came from 20 years of making hard decisions in the void between stars. The Valkyrie was 3 days out from the Kepler station, running a routine patrol along the Outer Rim territories where human space met the great unknown. They weren't supposed to encounter anything more interesting than asteroid miners and the occasional smuggler. "What do we have, Chun?" The young officer's fingers danced across her console, cleaning up the signal as best she could. "It's definitely alien in origin, sir. The translation matrix is giving me about 60% confidence, but what I'm getting—" She paused, double-checking her readings. "Sir, I think it's a distress call." Rodriguez leaned over her shoulder, studying the scrolling alien text that appeared on the secondary monitor. The universal translator was doing its best, but gaps remained where concepts simply didn't exist in human language. Still, certain words came through clearly. "Help, dying, monsters, sanctuary." "How far?" he asked simply. The signal originated from the Veil Nebula, approximately 4 light-years from our current position. "Sir, that puts it well outside charted space." The captain straightened, his mind already working through the implications. First contact protocols were clear, but flexible when it came to emergency situations. The Veil Nebula had been on the exploration schedule for the next decade, a massive stellar nursery that blocked most long-range sensors with its dense clouds of gas and cosmic dust. Whatever was out there had managed to punch a transmission through that interference, which meant either advanced technology or desperation powerful enough to overcome physics itself. "Commander Walsh," Rodriguez called to his first officer, a tall woman with steel-gray hair and the kind of calm that came from surviving the Proxima raids. "Plot a course for the Veil Nebula. Best possible speed." "Sir," Walsh replied without hesitation, though her eyebrows rose slightly. "That's going to put us at least a week behind schedule for our patrol circuit." "Noted. Chun, see if you can clean up that signal any further. I want to know what we're walking into." As the Valkyrie changed course, its antimatter engines flaring to life with renewed purpose, Sarah Chun worked feverishly to decode more of the alien transmission. What emerged painted a picture that made her stomach clench with sympathetic horror. The beings calling for help called themselves the Kythera, and they were dying. Not from war or plague, but from something they could only describe as the hunger that walks. Their homeworld of Arasai had been overrun by creatures that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time, entities that fed on what the translator rendered alternately as life essence, soul, energy, or simply the spark that makes thought possible. The Kythera had been a peaceful species, apparently. Their messages spoke of art, philosophy, and scientific advancement. They had never developed serious military technology because they had never encountered anything that required it. When the entities they called the Umbrals had emerged from what seemed to be tears in reality itself, the Kythera had been helpless. "Captain," Chun said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm picking up additional transmissions. Not from the original source, but scattered across this entire region of space. Sir, I think multiple worlds are under attack." Rodriguez felt a chill that had nothing to do with the recycled air of the ship's environmental systems. "How many?" "At least 7 distinct sources, possibly more. The signals are fragmenting as I try to lock onto them. Whatever these umbrals are, they're spreading fast." The bridge fell silent, except for the background hum of the ship's systems. Every member of the crew was thinking the same thing, though none wanted to voice it. They were a single vessel, carrying a complement of 200 souls, including a company of colonial marines. Even if they were willing to risk everything to help these aliens, what could they possibly do against an enemy that had overwhelmed multiple worlds? Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, commanding officer of the Valkyrie's Marine Detachment, chose that moment to step onto the bridge. Morrison was built like a siege engine, broad shoulders, scarred hands, and eyes that had seen too much combat to ever be truly surprised again. He'd been listening to the chatter on the comm channels, and his expression was grim. "Captain, my Marines are ready to deploy if needed. But I have to ask, do we have any intel on what we're actually facing?" Rodriguez gestured to the main screen, where Chun had managed to piece together a rough tactical overview. The Veil Nebula spread across the display like a wound in space, its swirling gas clouds lit from within by the fierce radiation of newborn stars. Red markers indicated the suspected location of distress signals, scattered across an area that would take months to search properly. Hostile entities of unknown origin and capability, Rodriguez said. Multiple worlds under siege. No indication of human contact or involvement. Morrison studied the display with a professional eye. Rules of engagement? It was the question that mattered most. Humanity had learned hard lessons about intervening in alien conflicts during the expansion period. Good intentions could backfire spectacularly when cultural differences weren't properly understood. But the universal translator was picking up concepts that transcended cultural barriers. Pain, fear, the desperate love of parents for their children. We investigate, Rodriguez decided. We assess the situation. If we can help without compromising Earth's security or starting an interstellar incident, we help. If we can't, he let the sentence hang. Understood, sir. As the Valkyrie pushed deeper into uncharted space, its sensors probing ahead through the treacherous currents of the nebula, Chun continued monitoring the alien transmissions. What she found wasn't encouraging. The signals were growing weaker, more desperate. Several had cut off entirely, leaving only the hollow silence of dead worlds. But one transmission stood out from the rest. It was stronger, more coherent, and carried what seemed to be tactical information rather than just pleas for help. The source identified itself as Kithra Defense Command, apparently some kind of hastily assembled military organization trying to coordinate resistance against the Umbral invasion. Captain, Chin called out, excitement cutting through her worry. I think I found someone who can actually talk to us. The signal's coming from what appears to be a space station or a large vessel, and they're using military encryption protocols. Primitive by our standards, but organized. Can you establish two-way communication? I think so, sir. Give me a few minutes to sync our transmission protocols with theirs. Those few minutes stretched into an hour as the Valkyrie navigated the outer edges of the Veil Nebula, its hull plates groaning under the stress of gravitational anomalies and radiation storms. Finally, Chin looked up with a mixture of triumph and trepidation. Connection established, sir. I'm receiving a direct transmission from someone who identifies himself as Strategic Coordinator Vexhai of the Kithra Emergency Defense Coalition. On screen, the main display flickered, then resolved into an image that made several bridge officers gasp. The being facing them was clearly not human, but there was something almost familiar about its form. Roughly humanoid in shape, the Kithra stood perhaps 7 feet tall, with elongated limbs and a graceful neck that supported a head dominated by large, multifaceted eyes that seemed to shift color as they moved. Its skin had a translucent quality, revealing what might have been a circulatory system that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. When Vexhai spoke, his words were accompanied by the soft chiming of what might have been emotional undertones, a musical quality that the universal translator couldn't quite capture. Unknown vessel, please identify yourselves. We had prayed that our distress calls might reach others, but we feared we were alone in this darkness. Rodriguez stepped forward, clasping his hands behind his back in a gesture of formal respect. Strategic Coordinator Vexhai, I am Captain Marcus Rodriguez of the United Earth ship Valkyrie. We received your distress transmissions and have come to offer assistance if possible. The alien's large eyes seemed to brighten, the bioluminescent patterns beneath his skin shifting to warmer hues. Earth, we are not familiar with your world, but any who would answer our calls in this dark hour are welcome as brothers. Captain Rodriguez, our situation is dire. The Umbrals have overrun 7 worlds in our local cluster, and 3 more are under direct assault. Our fleet, what remains of it, is barely holding the line at the Sanctuary Station. Can you tell us more about these Umbrals? We have no previous contact with this species. Vexhai's patterns dimmed, cycling through what could only be interpreted as expressions of fear and revulsion. They are not truly a species as you might understand it. They are entities that exist partially in what you might call normal space and partially in something else. They feed on the electrical patterns that create consciousness, leaving behind empty shells that still live but no longer think or dream. Morrison stepped into view of the communication pickup. Strategic Coordinator, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, commanding the military forces aboard this vessel. What kind of defensive capabilities do your people possess? Minimal, Vex High admitted, his musical tones taking on harmonics of shame. We were a peaceful people, more concerned with art and philosophy than warfare. Our ships have basic defensive systems, enough to deal with space hazards and the occasional meteorite, but nothing designed for combat against entities that can phase through solid matter and exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The bridge fell silent as the implications sank in. Rodriguez found himself thinking of Earth, of the billions of humans who had never seen combat, never imagined that consciousness itself could be prey for something that hungered in the dark between stars. Strategic Coordinator, he said finally, we would like to rendezvous with your sanctuary station and assess the situation firsthand. Will you transmit coordinates and safe passage instructions? Of course, Captain Rodriguez. But I must warn you, the space around Sanctuary Station is contested. The Umbrals attack in waves, and our sensors often cannot detect them until they are already among our ships. Your vessel, it is military in design? Yes, Rodriguez replied simply. Then perhaps there's hope after all. Captain, I will transmit the coordinates immediately. But please, if you value the lives of your crew, approach with extreme caution. The Umbrals seemed drawn to strong emotional responses, particularly fear and aggression. The calmer your people remain, the better chance you have of reaching us intact. As the transmission ended and Chen began receiving navigation data from the alien command station, Rodriguez turned to address his bridge crew. Each face reflected the same mixture of determination and apprehension that he felt churning in his own gut. Ladies and gentlemen, he said quietly, we're about to make first contact with a hostile alien species that exists partially outside our understanding of physics. Our mission parameters have just expanded from patrol duty to potential rescue operations across multiple worlds. He paused, studying each face in turn. Anyone who has objections to this course of action is free to voice them now. No one spoke. The silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then, Commander Walsh cleared her throat. Sir, how do we fight something that exists in multiple dimensions? Rodriguez looked at the tactical display, where the locations of umbral attacks were spreading like a disease across the star chart. We figure it out as we go, Commander. We figure it out as we go. As the Valkyrie adjusted course towards Sanctuary Station, deep in the heart of the Veil Nebula where alien refugees waited in desperate hope, Captain Rodriguez couldn't shake the feeling that humanity was about to face its greatest test yet. They had always prided themselves on being the species that didn't back down from a fight, the ones who stepped forward when others stepped back. Now they were about to discover if that reputation was deserved, or if it was just another story told by a young species that had never encountered true darkness. The Sanctuary Station materialized out of the nebula's swirling chaos like a cathedral built from starlight and desperation. As the Valkyrie approached through the designated safe corridor, Captain Rodriguez found himself staring at something that challenged every assumption he'd held about alien engineering capabilities. The station was massive, easily 10 kilometers across at its widest point, but its design defied conventional military or industrial logic. Instead of the angular, utilitarian structures humans favored, Sanctuary Station flowed like a living thing, its surfaces curved and organic, covered in what appeared to be bioluminescent patterns that pulsed in complex rhythms. Docking pylons extended from a main structure like flowering branches, each one cradling vessels of various sizes and configurations. Jesus Christ, whispered Navigator Thompson, his usual composure cracking at the sight. How many ships are docked there? Communications Officer Chun was already running the numbers, her scanners working overtime to catalog the refugee fleet. I'm reading approximately 2,000 individual vessels, sir. Everything from personal craft to what looks like converted cargo haulers. And Captain, she paused, her voice growing tight. I'm detecting massive life signs. There have to be millions of beings aboard that station. The scale of the refugee crisis hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. This wasn't just a military conflict. It was a mass exodus, an entire civilization fleeing for its survival. As they drew closer, the tactical situation became clearer. The station was surrounded by a defensive perimeter of Kithra warships, if they could be called that. The vessels were beautiful in their alien way, sleek and graceful, but their weapons appeared to be little more than converted mining lasers and civilian-grade deflector shields. Incoming transmission from Sanctuary Station, Chun announced. On screen, Strategic Coordinator Vex High appeared again, but this time Rodriguez could see the strain etched into every line of his alien features. The bioluminescent patterns beneath his skin flickered erratically, and his large eyes held the hollow look of someone who had seen too much death in too short a time. Captain Rodriguez, welcome to what remains of our civilization. I apologize for the modest nature of our defensive preparations. We have done what we can with civilian vessels and mining equipment, but I fear it will not be enough when the Umbrals return. Rodriguez studied the tactical display, noting the gaps in the defensive formation and the obvious improvisation in their positioning. When do you expect the next attack? Our pattern analysis suggests they will come again within the next 6 to 8 hours. They seem to operate on cycles, though we do not understand why. They strike, withdraw, then return stronger than before. Vexai's patterns shifted to darker hues. Each wave has been more devastating than the last. We estimate we have perhaps 2 more defensive actions before our lines collapse entirely. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison stepped into view, his scarred face grim but determined. Strategic Coordinator, my Marines would like permission to board your station and assess your defensive capabilities. We may be able to suggest improvements or provide direct assistance. Vexai's eyes brightened considerably. Of course, Colonel Morrison. Docket Bay 7. I will have escort teams waiting to guide you through our security protocols. But please, prepare your people for what they will see. The refugees from the fallen worlds. Many carry scars that go beyond the physical. As the Valkyrie maneuvered toward the designated docking bay, Rodriguez felt the weight of command settling more heavily on his shoulders. He was about to commit his ship and crew to a conflict they barely understood against an enemy that defied conventional tactical analysis. But the alternative, leaving millions of innocents to die, was unthinkable. The docking process took nearly an hour, partly due to the unfamiliar alien technology and partly because of the sheer volume of traffic around the station. Refugee ships were arriving constantly, many of them damaged and overcrowded, their occupants fleeing from worlds that had already fallen to the Umbral assault. Morrison's Marines were the first to cross into the station proper, their combat armor and weapons drawing curious stares from the alien refugees. The Kithara were not the only species seeking sanctuary. Rodriguez counted at least 6 different alien races in the first corridor alone, all of them sharing the same haunted expression of survivors who had lost everything. The escort team that met them was led by someone Vexai introduced as Defense Coordinator Yelandra, a Kithara female whose bioluminescent patterns seemed permanently fixed in what the Universal Translator interpreted as grim determination. Her English, while accented with harmonic undertones, was remarkably clear. Captain Rodriguez, Colonel Morrison, thank you for coming. I wish the circumstances were different, but we are grateful for any assistance you can provide. She gestured down a corridor that stretched away into the station's depths. If you will follow me, I will show you our command center and explain our current tactical situation. As they walked, Morrison found himself studying the alien refugees they passed. Many bore visible injuries, burns, missing limbs, the telltale marks of hasty medical treatment. But it was their eyes that disturbed him most. Every face, regardless of species, carried the same expression of existential terror, as if they had seen something that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. Defense Coordinator, he said quietly, can you tell me more about how the Umbrals attack? Standard tactical doctrine suggests that any enemy, no matter how alien, must have weaknesses we can exploit. Yelandra's patterns flickered with what might have been bitter amusement. Colonel Morrison, I appreciate your optimism, but the Umbrals do not follow what you call standard tactical doctrine. They appear without warning, sometimes materializing directly inside our ships despite closed doors and active shields. They show no interest in conventional military objectives. They ignore strategic installations and resource centers. Instead, they seek out areas with the highest concentration of conscious beings. They entered a vast chamber that served as the station's command center, and Rodriguez felt his breath catch. The space was filled with holographic displays showing the tactical situation across dozens of star systems. Each display painted the same picture. Worlds going dark, refugee streams flowing toward whatever safe havens remained, and the inexorable advance of something that seemed to consume entire civilizations. The worst part, Yelandra continued, is that they don't kill quickly. When an umbral feeds on a conscious being, it leaves the body intact but drains away everything that made that person, well, a person. The victims remain alive, but they become empty shells, breathing, moving, but incapable of thought or emotion. Our psychologists believe this may actually be more traumatic for the survivors than simple death would be. A new voice entered the conversation, deeper and more resonant than the Kithara. It is worse than traumatic. It is an abomination that violates the fundamental order of existence. Rodriguez turned to see a new alien approaching, this one clearly from a different species. Where the Kithara were tall and graceful, this being was broad and heavily built with rocky, mineral-like skin that seemed to shift and change texture as he moved. His eyes glowed with an inner fire that spoke of volcanic origins. "Captain Rodriguez," Yelandra said, "allow me to introduce Forge Master Kolthek of the Pyrian Collective." His people were among the first to encounter the Umbrals. Kolthek's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "My world burned for 3 days before we understood what we faced. The Umbrals are not merely predators. They're a cancer upon reality itself. They consume not just individuals, but the very concept of individuality. Where they pass, only emptiness remains." Morrison leaned forward, his tactical mind working overtime. "Forge Master, you said your world burned. Does that mean you found ways to fight them effectively?" "Fight them? No. Delay them? Perhaps. We discovered that they're vulnerable to certain types of energy discharge, specifically the kind produced by antimatter annihilation. But the cost." Kolthek's glowing eyes dimmed. "We destroyed entire cities to create the necessary energy levels. The cure became almost as devastating as the disease." Rodriguez felt a chill run down his spine. The Valkyrie's main engines used antimatter, as did most human military vessels. If the Pyrian were correct about the Umbral's vulnerability, humanity might actually have the tools to fight back. But the implications were staggering. They were talking about using weapons of mass destruction against an enemy that existed partially outside normal space-time. "Forge Master," he said carefully, "would you be willing to share your technical data about these energy discharges? We may have capabilities that your people lacked." Kolthek's rocky features shifted into what might have been surprise. "You have antimatter weapons? Then perhaps there is hope after all. But, Captain, you must understand, the Umbrals learn. Each encounter teaches them new ways to avoid our defenses. What worked on Pyrian Prime may not work here." A new alarm began sounding throughout the command center, and every display suddenly shifted to show the same thing. Massive spatial distortions forming at the edge of the Sanctuary Station's sensor range. The distortions pulsed with an unnatural darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "They come," Vexai announced, his voice carrying harmonics of barely controlled panic. "All ships to defensive positions. This is not a drill." Rodriguez watched as the alien fleet scrambled to form defensive formations, their movements coordinated but obviously desperate. The approaching Umbral forces weren't showing up as discrete targets on the sensors. Instead, they appeared as areas of increasing darkness, zones where space itself seemed to be folding inward on itself. "Colonel Morrison," he said quickly, "get your Marines back to the ship immediately. We need to see what our weapons can do against these things." "Sir," Morrison replied, already moving toward the exit. "What about the refugees? If the station falls, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Right now, we need to prove to ourselves and our allies that humanity can actually fight these things." As the Marines rushed back to their ship, Rodriguez found himself staring at the tactical displays with growing unease. The approaching Umbral forces weren't behaving like any enemy he'd ever studied. They weren't advancing in formation or following recognizable strategic patterns. Instead, they seemed to be seeping through space like oil through water, darkness spreading wherever they touched. "Defense Coordinator Yelandra," he said, "we're going to take the Valkyrie into combat. I need your people to fall back and protect the refugee ships while we test our weapons against the Umbrals. Captain, with respect, your single vessel cannot hope to hold back an Umbral assault wave. Even our combined fleet barely managed to delay them last time." Rodriguez allowed himself a grim smile. "Yelandra, you've never seen humans fight. We have a saying back home. When the situation is hopeless, that's when we do our best work." As the Valkyrie undocked from Sanctuary Station and moved toward the edge of the defensive perimeter, Rodriguez felt the familiar tension that always preceded combat. But this was different from any battle he'd fought before. This wasn't about territory or resources or political ideology. This was about the fundamental right of conscious beings to exist, to think, to dream, to hope. Behind them, millions of refugees waited in desperate anticipation. Ahead, darkness itself seemed to be advancing through the void, bringing with it a hunger that could devour souls. And between them stood a single human warship and her crew, about to discover whether humanity's reputation for stubborn heroism was enough to face an enemy that existed beyond the normal boundaries of reality. "All hands, this is the captain," Rodriguez announced over the ship's intercom. "We are about to engage an alien enemy about which we know very little. What we do know is that they threaten the lives of millions of innocent beings who have asked for our help. Today, we discover what humanity is really made of. Today, we find out if we deserve our place among the stars." On the main screen, the darkness continued to advance, and Rodriguez could swear he felt something looking back at him from within that unnatural night. Something hungry, something that had never encountered the particular kind of madness that humans called courage. The first umbral emerged from the darkness like a nightmare given form, its shape defying every natural law Rodriguez thought he understood. It wasn't quite solid, wasn't quite energy, but something that existed in the spaces between both. The creature, if it could be called that, resembled a writhing mass of shadow that constantly shifted between dimensions, sometimes appearing as a flat silhouette, sometimes as a three-dimensional void that hurt to look at directly. "Weapons," Rodriguez commanded, his voice steady despite the alien terror creeping up his spine. "Target the nearest contact and fire everything we have." The Valkyrie's main railgun batteries opened up first, hurling streams of hypervelocity projectiles at the approaching darkness. The rounds passed harmlessly through the umbral's shifting form, striking nothing but empty space where solid matter should have been. Plasma cannons fired next, their brilliant beams illuminating the void with deadly rainbow light. But the energy weapons had no more effect than the kinetic rounds. "Captain," called Weapons Officer Lieutenant Park, his voice tight with frustration, "conventional weapons are showing zero effectiveness. The target appears to be phasing in and out of our dimensional space." Rodriguez watched more umbrals emerge from the roiling darkness, each one a unique horror that seemed designed to mock the concept of physical reality. Some appeared as geometric impossibilities, shapes with too many angles, surfaces that folded through themselves in ways that made his eyes water. Others resembled organic nightmares, all teeth and hunger and reaching darkness. "Sir," Chief Engineer O'Brien's voice crackled over the comm from the engine room. "I'm reading massive dimensional distortions around the ship. Whatever those things are, they're warping space-time just by existing." The tactical display showed the alien defensive fleet opening fire with their converted mining lasers and improvised weapons. The beam struck the umbrals with no more effect than the Valkyrie's arsenal had achieved. But as Rodriguez watched, he began to notice something crucial. The aliens were firing in desperation, their crews terrified, and their aim wild. Their weapons might not be penetrating the umbral's dimensional phasing, but they weren't targeting the right vulnerabilities either. "Forge Master Kolthek mentioned antimatter," Rodriguez said to his weapons officer. "Lieutenant Park, can we configure one of our torpedoes for close proximity antimatter detonation?" "Yes, sir, but we need to get the warhead within point-blank range. These things don't seem to follow predictable movement patterns." "Then we get creative. Commander Walsh, bring us about on an intercept course with the largest umbral. Park, prepare a full spread of antimatter torpedoes with proximity fuses set for maximum energy discharge." As the Valkyrie accelerated toward the heart of the umbral formation, Rodriguez could feel the creature's presence pressing against his mind like a physical weight. It wasn't quite telepathy, but something deeper and more invasive, a touch that made him question his own thoughts, his own identity. The bridge crew was feeling it too. Navigator Thompson's hands were shaking as he worked his console, and Communications Officer Chun had gone pale, her usual composure cracking under the psychological assault. But they held their positions, their training and determination overriding their fear. "Firing solution locked," Park announced through gritted teeth. "Range 2,000 meters and closing. Fire." 6 antimatter torpedoes streaked away from the Valkyrie's launch tubes, their brilliant exhaust trails cutting through the darkness like falling stars. The first 3 detonated in sequence, each explosion releasing the equivalent of several hundred nuclear weapons worth of pure energy. The violent light was blinding even through the ship's filtered viewports, and, for a moment, the entire region of space lit up like a newborn sun. When the glare faded, Rodriguez found himself staring at something unprecedented. The largest umbral was writhing in what could only be described as pain, its shifting form flickering between dimensions as if it were struggling to maintain coherence. Dark fluid that might have been blood, or energy, or something else entirely, leaked from wounds that appeared and disappeared as the creature phased. "Direct hit," Park shouted, his earlier frustration replaced by fierce satisfaction. The antimatter detonations are definitely causing damage. But their victory was short-lived. The wounded umbral let out a sound that bypassed the ears entirely, striking directly at the crew's consciousness with a note of pure existential anguish. Every person on the bridge staggered, clutching their heads, as the alien scream reverberated through their minds. Worse, the other umbrals were responding to their wounded companion's distress. They began moving faster, more aggressively, and their forms were shifting into configurations that seemed designed for maximum psychological impact. Rodriguez watched in growing horror as one of the creatures began to take on the shape of his childhood home, complete with the front porch where his grandmother used to wait for him after school. But the details were wrong, twisted, corrupted into something that made the familiar into a source of revulsion. "They're adapting," Rodriguez said grimly. "They're using our own memories against us." The umbrals reached the alien defensive line like a wave of living darkness. Rodriguez watched helplessly as the creatures flowed around, and, through the makeshift warships, their dimensional phasing rendering the alien vessel's shields and armor utterly useless. Crews aboard the defender ships began screaming over the comm channels, not in pain, but in despair, as they watched their crewmates succumb to the umbral's feeding. "Captain," Chen called out, her voice strained, "I'm receiving emergency signals from multiple refugee ships. The umbrals aren't just attacking the military vessels, they're going after the civilian fleet as well." On the tactical display, Rodriguez could see the awful truth unfolding. The umbrals weren't following standard military doctrine because they weren't a military force in any conventional sense. They were predators, and they were targeting the largest concentration of conscious minds available, the millions of refugees aboard Sanctuary Station. A new voice cut through the chaos on the communication channels. Strategic Coordinator Vex High, his harmonic tones stretched thin with desperation. All vessels, this is Sanctuary Command. We are implementing Evacuation Protocol 7. All non-essential personnel to the emergency craft immediately. Repeat, we are abandoning the station." Rodriguez felt his jaw clench. The aliens were preparing to scatter, to flee deeper into the nebula in the hope that some of them might escape the umbral assault. It was a reasonable tactical decision, but it would also mean the death or worse for millions of beings who couldn't fit aboard the limited number of escape craft. "Captain," Commander Walsh said quietly, "we should consider our own withdrawal. We've proven that our weapons can hurt them, but we can't hold off an entire assault wave by ourselves." Rodriguez looked at the tactical display, counting the odds. One human ship against dozens of creatures that existed partially outside reality. Millions of innocent lives hanging in the balance. The rational choice was obvious, which was exactly why he couldn't make it. "Belay that," he said firmly. "Helm, bring us about to intercept the umbrals moving toward the refugee ships. All hands, prepare for close-quarters engagement." Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's voice crackled over the comm from the Marine Bay. "Captain, my people are ready to deploy if needed. These things might be able to phase through ship hulls, but let's see how they handle a squad of Marines with antimatter charges." "Negative, Colonel. I'm not risking ground troops against an enemy we still don't understand. But keep your people ready. We might need boarding action capabilities if any of the refugee ships request assistance." The Valkyrie accelerated toward the nearest group of umbrals, its antimatter engines flaring with renewed intensity. Behind them, the alien defensive fleet was falling back in disorder, their improvised formations shattered by an enemy that simply ignored conventional tactics. But ahead lay the refugee ships, slow, overcrowded vessels filled with families and children and the elderly, all of them helpless against the approaching darkness. "Weapons," Rodriguez commanded. "Prepare for continuous antimatter torpedo bombardment. I want proximity fuses set for maximum area effect. We're going to create a barrier between those creatures and the refugee fleet." "Sir," Park replied, "at that rate of fire, we'll exhaust our antimatter reserves in less than 20 minutes. Then we make every shot count. Chief O'Brien, I need maximum power to the engines and weapon systems. Divert everything non-essential." As the Valkyrie dove into the heart of the umbral formation, its weapons blazing like an avenging angel, Rodriguez felt the strange calm that came in moments of absolute commitment. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and facing an enemy that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality itself. By any rational measure, they were about to die horribly. But they were also the only things standing between millions of innocent beings and a fate worse than death. And that, Rodriguez reflected as antimatter explosions lit up the void around them, was exactly the kind of impossible situation that brought out the best in humanity. The Umbrals were learning to avoid the antimatter detonations, their forms shifting and phasing to minimize damage. But they were also being forced to divert attention from the refugee ships to deal with the unexpected threat posed by a single human vessel that refused to acknowledge the futility of its position. On the tactical display, Rodriguez could see other human ships arriving at the edge of the nebula, patrol vessels, and cargo haulers that had picked up the Valkyrie's distress beacon and were racing to provide assistance. They were still hours away, but their approach was being broadcast on all channels, letting the Umbrals know that humanity was coming in force. "Captain," Chen called out, her voice carrying a note of amazement, "I'm receiving signals from the refugee ships. They're singing." Rodriguez paused in his tactical calculations, listening as the alien harmonies filled the bridge through the comm system. It wasn't a song of despair or terror. It was something else entirely. Hope, perhaps, or gratitude, or simply the refusal to let darkness have the final word. As the Valkyrie continued its desperate battle against impossible odds, surrounded by the songs of those they fought to protect, Rodriguez realized that victory might not be measured in enemy ships destroyed or strategic objectives secured. Sometimes, victory was simply the decision to stand when everything rational said you should run. Sometimes, victory was showing the universe that some things were worth dying for, and that as long as conscious beings drew breath, the darkness would never go unopposed. The songs of the refugees changed everything. Rodriguez first noticed it during the Valkyrie's third torpedo run against the Umbral formation. The creatures, which had been adapting rapidly to avoid the antimatter detonations, suddenly seemed to lose coordination. Their fluid movements became erratic, and several of them began to phase uncontrollably between dimensions, as if the harmonic frequencies were disrupting their ability to maintain coherence. "Captain," Chen called out excitedly, "the alien songs are having an effect on the Umbrals. I'm reading massive instabilities in their dimensional matrices whenever the harmonic frequencies reach certain resonant peaks." Rodriguez felt a surge of hope cut through his combat-focused concentration. "Can you identify the specific frequencies that are causing the disruption?" "Working on it, sir. The universal translator is having trouble with the musical elements, but I think I can isolate the key harmonic patterns." Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's voice crackled over the comm from his position in the Marine Bay. "Captain, my people are observing something interesting down here. The Umbrals that were trying to phase through our hull have pulled back. It's like they can't maintain their dimensional shift while those songs are playing." Rodriguez turned to his communications officer with growing excitement. "Chun, can we amplify those alien songs and broadcast them through our own communication arrays?" "Yes, sir, but I'll need a few minutes to reconfigure the transmission system. The harmonic complexity is beyond anything in our standard protocols." "Do it, and patch me through to Strategic Coordinator Vex-High. I think we may have found our edge." As Chun worked frantically to modify the Valkyrie's communication system, Rodriguez watched the tactical display with renewed hope. The Umbrals were still dangerous, still pressing their attack against the refugee fleet, but their movements had become increasingly erratic. Whatever the songs represented, prayer, defiance, or something else entirely, they were clearly anathema to creatures that fed on consciousness and despair. Vex-High's image appeared on the main screen, his bioluminescent patterns flickering with what Rodriguez had learned to recognize as desperate hope. Captain Rodriguez, your vessel's antimatter weapons have given us our first effective resistance to the Umbrals. How can we coordinate our efforts? Strategic Coordinator, those songs your people are singing, they're disrupting the Umbral's ability to phase between dimensions. We need every ship, every refugee, every conscious being in your fleet to join in. Can you coordinate a fleet-wide harmonic broadcast? Bexhi's large eyes widened with understanding. Of course, the songs are expressions of our fundamental nature as conscious beings. Our hopes, our dreams, our refusal to surrender our identity to the void. The Umbrals feed on consciousness, but perhaps they cannot digest consciousness that actively asserts itself. Within minutes, the communication channels were flooded with a symphony of alien voices. Hundreds of different species, each adding their own harmonic elements to a growing chorus that seemed to make space itself vibrate with defiant life. The effect on the Umbrals was immediate and dramatic. Several of the creatures began to dissolve entirely, their forms unable to maintain coherence in the face of such concentrated conscious resistance. But the largest Umbral, the one Rodriguez had wounded in the initial antimatter attack, was adapting once again. Instead of retreating, it began to change its form into something even more disturbing, a twisted reflection of the singing aliens themselves, complete with mockeries of their bioluminescent patterns and harmonic voices. The creature's song was a corruption of everything the refugees represented, turning hope into despair, defiance into submission. It's trying to turn our own weapon against us, Rodriguez realized grimly. Chun, can we counter its harmonic disruption? I'm trying, sir, but it's adapting too quickly. Whatever intelligence controls these things, it's learning from every encounter. The corrupted song of the largest Umbral was having a devastating effect on the refugee fleet. Ships that had been joining the harmonic chorus began to fall silent as their crews succumbed to the creature's psychological assault. Worse, Rodriguez could see that some of the refugee vessels were beginning to drift aimlessly, their navigation systems apparently abandoned as their crews lost the will to resist. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison appeared on the bridge, having rushed up from the Marine Bay with an expression of grim determination. Captain, I have an idea. What if we take the fight directly to that thing? My Marines are equipped with portable antimatter charges. If we can get close enough. Rodriguez studied the tactical display, weighing the risks. A boarding action against a creature that existed partially outside normal space-time was beyond dangerous. It was potentially suicidal. But the alternative was watching millions of refugees succumb to the Umbral's corrupted song. Colonel, how many volunteers do you have? Sir, every Marine on this ship volunteered the moment they understood what we were facing. These things don't just kill. They erase everything that makes a person human. That's not acceptable. Rodriguez felt a familiar surge of pride in his species. In the face of an enemy that challenged the very concept of individual existence, humanity's response was not fear or despair, but the kind of stubborn courage that had carried them to the stars in the first place. Approved. Take your best people and enough antimatter charges to crack a small moon. We'll get you as close as possible to that thing, but once you're aboard, or whatever the equivalent is when dealing with a creature that exists in multiple dimensions, you're on your own. As Morrison's Marines prepared for what might be the strangest boarding action in human history, the Valkyrie maneuvered closer to the massive Umbral. Up close, the creature was even more disturbing than it had appeared on the tactical display. It constantly shifted between configurations, sometimes appearing as a vast ship filled with empty corridors and chambers, sometimes as a writhing mass of darkness that seemed to extend into dimensions the human mind couldn't process. Marine boarding pods away, announced the launch control officer. Rodriguez watched as 3 heavily armored pods streaked toward the Umbral, their occupants sealed in powered armor designed to function in the most extreme environments. But nothing in their training had prepared them for an environment that existed partially outside reality itself. The first pod made contact with the Umbral's shifting surface and simply disappeared, phasing into whatever dimension the creature used as its primary existence. The second pod followed, then the third, carrying Lieutenant Colonel Morrison and his handpicked team into a realm where the normal laws of physics no longer applied. For several agonizing minutes, there was no communication from the boarding party. Then, Morrison's voice crackled over the comm, distorted by dimensional interference, but unmistakably human in its determination. Control, this is boarding Team Alpha. We're inside the target, but inside doesn't really describe it. The geometry here is completely non-Euclidean. My Marines are having trouble maintaining orientation, but we're advancing toward what appears to be the creature's central mass. Rodriguez found himself holding his breath as he listened to Morrison's reports. The Marines were encountering things that had no names in human language. Corridors that led in impossible directions, chambers that were larger on the inside than their external dimensions should allow, and everywhere a sense of hunger that pressed against their minds like a physical weight. "We're taking casualties," Morrison reported grimly. "Not physical damage. The creature seems to be feeding on my people's memories and personality traits." Sergeant Garcia just forgot how to speak, and Corporal Kim is staring at his rifle like he's never seen one before. But we're still advancing. On the main tactical display, Rodriguez could see that Morrison's assault was having an effect. The Umbral's corrupted song was faltering, its harmonic patterns becoming unstable as the Marines pressed deeper into its dimensional structure. The refugee fleet was beginning to sing again, their voices joining together in renewed defiance. "Colonel," Rodriguez called over the comm, "whatever you're doing, keep doing it. The creature's psychic assault is weakening." "Understood, Captain. We've reached what appears to be the center. It's... God, I can't describe what I'm seeing. It's like looking at the concept of hunger given form, preparing antimatter charges for detonation." The next few seconds stretched into eternity. Rodriguez watched the tactical display, where the massive umbral had begun to convulse, its form destabilizing as the Marines' antimatter charges tore through its dimensional matrix. The creature's song became a scream of rage and pain that somehow managed to convey absolute malice despite being entirely alien. Then the explosion came, not just in normal space, but across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The blast wave that emerged from the Umbral's collapsing form was visible not as light or energy, but as a ripple in reality itself, a distortion that made nearby space twist and flex before snapping back into its proper configuration. When the dimensional shockwave passed, the massive Umbral was gone, leaving only empty space and the scattered debris of its existence. But the cost had been enormous. Rodriguez's sensors showed no life signs from any of the Marine boarding pods. "Colonel Morrison, respond." He called over the comm, already knowing he would receive no answer. The bridge fell silent, except for the background hum of the ship's systems. 18 of humanity's finest had just sacrificed themselves to prove that consciousness, when properly motivated, could stand against even the darkest forces in the universe. They had shown that individual will, backed by collective determination, was stronger than any hunger that sought to devour the soul. But the battle wasn't over. The destruction of the largest umbral had disrupted the others, but they were already beginning to regroup, their forms shifting into new configurations as they learned from their leader's defeat. And in the distance, Rodriguez's sensors were detecting new dimensional distortions, reinforcements arriving from whatever realm the Umbrals called home. "Captain," Chen called out, "I'm receiving multiple signals from the edge of the nebula. Human fleet elements are arriving in force. Admiral Haze, aboard the dreadnought Yorktown, is requesting immediate tactical update." Rodriguez felt his shoulders straighten. Humanity was coming, and they were coming in force. The aliens had cried out for aid, and the human race had answered. Now it was time to show these creatures from beyond space that they had made a fundamental error in judgment. They had mistaken humanity's compassion for weakness. They were about to learn the difference between a species that extended help freely and a species that could not be stopped when its protective instincts were aroused. "Chun," Rodriguez said quietly, "transmit all tactical data to the incoming fleet. And send them one additional message. Tell them the Marines have shown us how to hurt these things. Tell them it's time to remind the universe why humanity earned its place among the stars." As the human reinforcements accelerated toward the battle zone, their antimatter engines flaring like stars in the darkness, Rodriguez allowed himself a moment of fierce satisfaction. The Umbrals had sought to feed on consciousness itself, to reduce thinking beings to empty shells devoid of hope or defiance. They had chosen the wrong species to prey upon. Now, they were going to learn what happened when humanity said no and meant it Admiral Elizabeth Haze materialized on the Valkyrie's bridge via emergency transport, just as the human fleet completed its deployment around Sanctuary Station. Rodriguez had never been so glad to see the stern-faced veteran, whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by her absolute refusal to abandon any mission involving civilian lives. "Captain Rodriguez," Haze said without preamble, "your initial report makes for interesting reading. Hostiles that exist in multiple dimensions, feed on consciousness itself, and are vulnerable to antimatter weapons and harmonic interference. I brought 18 ships of the line, and enough antimatter to crack a small planet. How do we kill these things permanently?" Rodriguez gestured to the tactical display, where the remaining Umbrals were massing for what appeared to be a final assault on the refugee fleet. "Admiral, we've learned that they adapt quickly to any single tactic, but they have trouble maintaining coherence when faced with multiple simultaneous threats. The alien songs disrupt their dimensional stability, our antimatter weapons can cause actual damage, and concentrated conscious resistance seems to interfere with their feeding process." Haze studied the display with the calculating gaze that had earned her 3 fleet commands. "So we hit them with everything at once. What's the status of the alien refugees?" "Approximately 2 million beings aboard Sanctuary Station and another 3 million scattered across various refugee ships. They're holding together, but barely. These people have lost everything, Admiral. Their homes, their families, their entire way of life. All they have left is each other, and the hope that someone, somewhere, might be willing to stand between them and oblivion." Haze nodded grimly. "Then that's what we do. We stand." The human fleet deployment was a thing of beauty to watch. 18 capital ships arranged themselves in a protective formation around the refugee vessels, their antimatter engines synchronized to create a pattern of overlapping defensive fields. Destroyer squadrons moved to intercept the approaching Umbrals, while heavy cruisers took position to provide covering fire with their antimatter torpedo batteries. But Haze had brought more than just firepower. The fleet included 2 of humanity's newest psychological warfare vessels, ships designed to project concentrated emotional states across vast distances. If consciousness could be used as a weapon against the Umbrals, then humanity would weaponize consciousness itself. "All ships," Haze broadcast on the fleet command frequency. "This is Admiral Haze. Today we face an enemy unlike any in human history. These creatures don't just want to kill us. They want to erase everything that makes us who we are. They want to reduce conscious beings to empty shells, to drain away hope and love and the simple joy of being alive." Her voice carried across every ship in the fleet, reaching not just the human crews but the alien refugees as well. The universal translator ensured that her words were understood by every species present. But they made one critical mistake. They assumed that consciousness was something to be consumed, something weak and fragile that could be drained away like water from a cup. They don't understand that consciousness, when properly motivated, doesn't just resist, it fights back. Today, we show them what happens when 2 million years of human evolution meets an enemy that threatens our fundamental right to exist. The Umbral assault began with the same dimensional distortions that had characterized their earlier attacks. But this time, they faced not a handful of improvised defenders, but the concentrated firepower of humanity's most advanced fleet. The first wave of creatures emerged from their dimensional rifts directly into a storm of antimatter fire that lit up the nebula like a second sun. The results were immediate and devastating. Umbrals that had shrugged off the desperate attacks of alien mining lasers found themselves torn apart by weapons that channeled the fundamental forces of creation itself. But, more importantly, they found themselves facing something they had never encountered before, a species that had turned warfare into an art form. Rodriguez watched from the Valkyrie's bridge as Admiral Haze orchestrated the battle with the precision of a master conductor. Destroyer squadrons herded the Umbrals into kill zones where heavy cruisers waited with prepared firing solutions. The psychological warfare ships projected waves of concentrated human determination, turning the very space around the Umbrals into a hostile environment that interfered with their dimensional phasing. But it was the refugee fleet's contribution that turned the tide decisively. Inspired by humanity's arrival and coordinated by the Valkyrie's communication systems, every alien voice in the fleet joined together in a song that transcended species boundaries. It wasn't just music, It was a declaration of existence itself, a harmonic proof that consciousness would not go quietly into whatever dark realm the Umbrals called home. The combined effect was overwhelming. Umbrals that had seemed unstoppable began to dissolve under the dual assault of human weapons and alien songs. Their dimensional matrices, already destabilized by the antimatter explosions, couldn't maintain coherence in the face of such concentrated conscious resistance. Admiral Rodriguez called over the command frequency. The Umbrals are beginning a general retreat. They're opening dimensional rifts back to their origin point. Haze appeared on a screen, her expression as determined as ever. Not acceptable, Captain. We don't just want them to retreat. We want them to understand that this region of space is under our protection. All ships, prepare for pursuit operations. What followed was the strangest chase in human military history. The human fleet followed the retreating Umbrals through dimensional rifts that existed partially outside normal space-time, their ship's sensors struggling to maintain lock on targets that flickered between realities. But the alien refugees came with them, their songs providing a harmonic anchor that kept the fleet oriented in the face of impossible geometry. The pursuit led to something that defied every assumption about the nature of space itself, a realm that existed in the spaces between dimensions, where the Umbrals had built what could only be described as a city. It was a massive structure that sprawled across multiple reality layers, fed by energy siphoned from the consciousness of a dozen different species. My God, breathed Navigator Thompson as the strange city appeared on the main display. They've been doing this for a long time. Look at those energy patterns. They're drawing power from minds across half the galaxy. Admiral Haze's voice cut through the stunned silence on the command frequency. All ships, target the central structure. Maximum antimatter spread. If we can destroy their base of operations, we might be able to free every consciousness they've imprisoned. The assault on the Umbral city was unlike anything in human military doctrine. The fleet had to fight not just enemy vessels, but the nature of reality itself, as the Umbrals twisted dimensional space to create impossible defensive positions. Ships found themselves firing at targets that were simultaneously above, below, and beside them, while enemy attacks came from directions that didn't technically exist. But humanity had brought its own impossibility to the battle, the absolute refusal to accept defeat when the stakes were high enough. Ship after ship pressed forward through dimensional mazes that would have driven lesser species insane, their crews held together by a simple truth that transcended species boundaries. Consciousness was worth defending, no matter the cost. The breakthrough came when the refugee fleet, still singing their defiant songs, passed through the outer defenses of the Umbral city. Their harmonic frequencies resonated with the imprisoned consciousness trapped within the structure's energy collectors, creating a feedback loop that destabilized the entire complex. Rodriguez watched in awe as millions of liberated minds, human, alien, and species he couldn't even identify, joined their voices to the refugee songs. The combined harmonic explosion tore through the Umbral city like a chain reaction, freeing consciousness that had been trapped for centuries. The Umbrals themselves, faced with the collapse of their feeding structure and the loss of their dimensional anchor, began to fade from existence entirely. Without their stolen energy to maintain coherence, they dissolved back into whatever primordial darkness had originally spawned them. In the aftermath, as the human fleet and refugee vessels found themselves back in normal space, surrounded by the scattered remnants of the Umbral city, Rodriguez realized that humanity had achieved something unprecedented. They had not just won a battle or saved a fleet of refugees. They had proven that consciousness itself, when properly motivated and organized, could stand against any force in the universe. Admiral Haze appeared on the communication screen, her stern expression softened by something that might have been wonder. Captain Rodriguez, preliminary reports suggest we've liberated approximately 15 million imprisoned consciousness from that place. Representatives from at least 30 different species want to speak with us about establishing formal diplomatic relations. Rodriguez looked around his bridge, noting the expressions of quiet pride on every face. They had answered an alien distress call with nothing more than human stubbornness and a refusal to let evil go unopposed. Now, they were looking at the foundation of what might become the galaxy's first truly universal alliance. Admiral, he said quietly, what are your orders? Haze smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. Orders, Captain? I think our orders are simple. We help whoever needs help. We stand between the darkness and anyone who asks for protection. We prove to the galaxy that consciousness, in any form, from any world, is worth defending. As the combined human and alien fleet began the long journey back to Sanctuary Station, now truly safe for the first time in months, Rodriguez found himself thinking about the Marines who had sacrificed themselves to prove that humans could hurt the Umbrals. Their names would be remembered, their courage celebrated, but, more importantly, their example would inspire others. The universe was vast and filled with dangers that humanity had not yet imagined. But it was also filled with beings capable of hope, love, joy, and the simple pleasure of conscious existence. And as long as those qualities existed somewhere in the galaxy, humanity would be there to defend them. The aliens had cried out for aid, and humanity had answered. In doing so, they had discovered something about themselves that even they hadn't fully understood. They were not just explorers or warriors or builders of civilizations. They were guardians of consciousness itself, protectors of the spark that made thought and dream and hope possible. And that, Rodriguez reflected as the refugee songs continued to fill the communication channels with their defiant beauty, was a responsibility they would carry gladly to the end of time. In the depths of space, surrounded by the grateful voices of a dozen different species, humanity had found its true calling among the stars.